The tradition of Buddhism says that one of the four signs, four things that the Buddha saw that started him on the path toward enlightenment, was a corpse, a dead body. Certainly death and the issue of death and what death represents and why death has to happen is at the core of a lot of the world's religious traditions. It's something that people struggle with. And especially the issue of after we die, what next? What comes after that? And an important part of that teaching in Buddhism has to do with the notion of what happens after we die, the idea of rebirth. Now, there are a lot of words that are used. The word reincarnation is used. The word rebirth is used to talk about the idea of coming back into the world and living another physical life after the current one. And lots of different religious traditions have ideas about that, both in Asia, in the East, and also in the West, in Europe, pre-Christian Europe. Even some early Christian writers sometimes kind of sound like they're talking about the idea of reincarnation. In the Buddhist tradition, the Buddha, in the writings attributed to quote him, doesn't use a particular single word to talk about this idea. There's no single word that we see in the old scriptures that describes this notion. Punarjanman, which is usually translated literally as birth again, what in Korean is called chaesang. That's one word that's used. Punarbhava, which would mean re-becoming. In Korean, that's huyu. These are different words that are used. And the term rebirth in sort of modern writing in English about this idea is usually used. Now, the specific idea of reincarnation, the idea of there being some sort of core permanent part of a person that goes from life to life, that carries on from one life to the next, dying in one body, putting on another body, going back into flesh. That's literally what reincarnation means, going back into flesh over again. That's something that we see in a lot of the world's religious traditions. Most well known, probably, though, in the religions of India, especially Hinduism. In Hinduism, they talk about the idea of Atman. Atman is the true self. It's sort of the real you, they would say. And that's the part that continues from life to life. That's the core of the person that puts on a new body from one life to the next. The Jain tradition, which also comes from India, has a similar idea, but they use the word jiva to talk about that. What in the West would probably be called the soul. The idea that the soul goes from life to life. You may have heard the term transmigration of souls, the soul going from one life to the next. The soul leaves one body, enters another body. So the soul, in effect, is the true person. That's the thing that goes from life to life. So that notion of Atman coming out of Hinduism is a word that we can compare directly to the Buddha's teaching about this, because he rejected that notion completely, very explicitly. He talked about An-Atman, no self. There is no continuing, permanent core element of a person that goes from life to life. So he explicitly rejected that idea. He said a person is more of a process. A person is a construction. A person is a temporary arrangement of what he called the skandhas, the heaps, the aggregates, the elements that go together to make a person that are just sort of temporarily and loosely combined together, of which he said there are 5. There's the material body, the form of the body, rupa, what in Korean is called seik. There's the sensation and feelings that we have in our minds, vedana, what in Korean is called su. There's the perceptions and discriminations that we have in our minds, samjña, it's called sang in Korean. There's the volition or mental formations that we have, samskara, hang in Korean. And then finally there's our consciousness, vijnana, sik in Korean. A person is just a temporary arrangement of those 5 things, according to the Buddha, which is obviously a very different point of view than what we get, for example, from the Hindu tradition. So I was thinking about this recently, walking around my house, and it's right after Christmas, and I'm watching my grandchildren play with Legos. And I realized Legos provide a really interesting way in which we can illustrate this idea. We can do a little kind of comparison between the Hindu teaching of reincarnation, for example, and the teaching of rebirth that we see in most streams of Buddhism. Tibetan Buddhism has an idea that's a little closer, perhaps, to the idea that we see in Hinduism than you would see in a lot of the rest of Buddhism. But if we can kind of contrast the sort of original teachings of the Buddha about this notion of anatman with the Hindu tradition. So a little comparison of reincarnation and rebirth. So if you think about this, it's supposed to represent a person, right? And this is the person in a body. And there's a core that's the center of that person, and that's the thing that continues from life to life. So when this person dies and the body and experience breaks up and starts to fall apart, but there's this continuing part that goes from life to life. And so now what that part can do is to slip into a new body, right? To be the next life of that Atman. And again, at the end of that life, that Atman can move from that life to another life, taking on form again, taking on a new body, once again being reincarnated, put back into flesh. And that's the Hindu point of view, with the addition that hopefully at some point what this Atman will achieve is a level of liberation that will allow for it to escape from this process, to achieve moksha, to escape from the cycle of samsara, of birth, death, and reincarnation. Now, Buddhism also talks about samskara, but since the Buddha had a different point of view about what a person represents, and specifically rejected this idea of Atman, we get a very different idea. We can take this idea of the core of a person and we can just throw that away because the Buddha said there's no such thing. What a person really consists of is those 5 elements, right? The form, which is the body, and then those 4 mental elements that I talked about, including the consciousness, and no core, no center, nothing that continues from life to life. So when the death happens, what's going to happen with this individual? Well, with death, the body and the mind break up. And then what will happen later is those elements will be reconstituted. So part of that may go together with other bits to be arranged in a new way for another life. Actually, let's do it that way, right? So that's the next life. What is it that's continuing? This is not the core of the person, right? Because everything's put together in a new fashion. There's nothing that is carried over from one life to another. So if that's the case, what's reborn? Why talk about the idea of rebirth at all? What is it that continues in the cycle of samsara, from birth to death to rebirth? Why would this be a concern? There has to be something that goes on, but it's not any of this stuff, right? It's not the body, it's not the consciousness, it's not the mind. What is it that continues from life to life? Well, actually, it's this. It's the energy that's combining all these things together. The idea of karma, that our actions have consequences, which in Buddhism is understood as being the stream of the uninterrupted stream of cause and effect, right? The continuous flow of that karma. It's the energy that carries forth from one life to the next. Another analogy that you can think of here would be, think about balls on a pool table. When the cue ball is hit and strikes another ball, that ball begins to move. What is it that's been transferred? What is it that has been moved from one ball to the next? And then that ball hits another ball and that ball begins to move. What's been transferred, right? The color doesn't transfer. The shape doesn't transfer. All that's being transferred is the energy of one ball being transferred to another ball. And it's the stream of energy that carries the motion through. Well, you can think about this notion of rebirth in a similar way. It's the energy of karma. It's the energy of the morality of our actions that carries the stream through, continuing the process until that energy is resolved. So I hope that this is a helpful idea, that this silly little metaphor can maybe make what can be a very difficult concept to understand more clear as we try to get our heads around what the teachings of the Buddha actually meant and what the implications of those are for our lives and the choices that we make.